This is to certify that on 13th of November, which is a Friday, by the way, 2020, Walter Scheidel has been awarded the Oswald-Spengler-Prize 2020 by the board of the Oswald-Spengler Society for the Study of Humanity and World History. David Engels, President, Gerd Morgenthaler, Secretary, Max Otte, Treasury. Walter Scheidel, once again, we congratulate you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so very much. Let me start by offering my thanks to David Engels, to Gerd Morgenthaler and Max Otte for organizing this meeting, for your very kind words, and above all for bestowing this honor on me, which came as a great surprise. Now, without wishing to detract in any way from the luster of the eponymous hero of the society and this event, I must admit that the true highlight of receiving this award is that I get to follow in the footsteps of Michel Houellebecq, whose books I have keenly read for many years. I realize that the fame of my predecessor is bound to turn this award event into a rather anticlimactic occasion, but at least nobody can say that this is my fault, as only very few people could possibly hope to measure up to the inaugural recipient of the Oswald-Spengler-Prize. Although I might add, there's at least one way it could get even worse for me if Karl Ove Knausgaard were to win the prize as well. He's one of the few contemporary authors I value even more than Monsieur Houellebecq, and he is as Spenglerian as they come. Anyway, the best I could do was to turn to Houellebecq's speech from 2 years ago. He devoted it to the question of whether he had been influenced by Spengler, and did so by giving a fairly complex answer. When I ask myself the same question, my answer is likewise not a simple one. When I first encountered Spengler's work as a student at university, I was deeply skeptical of grand visions of any kind. Yet revisiting him more than 30 years later, I now realize that we have more in common than I would have thought. When I say that, I'm not primarily thinking of his overall vision of historical fate. This is not the place to discuss whether this vision makes sense to me. Suffice it to make a very simple point, that there now seems to be a surprisingly broad consensus about the limited shelf life of what is often called Western civilization. Both conservatives and progressives tend to view it as being in the process of being deconstructed and dismantled, even as they attach rather different value judgments to this process. Given that broad consensus, it would seem hard to avoid the conclusion that Spengler might well have been on to something. But today I want to focus on a different element of Spengler's work, namely the eminently practical issue of how we ought to approach the study of history. It is in this area that I see the deepest affinities between his preferences and my own. It is also an area in which his pioneering efforts deserve the utmost attention and respect, and now more than ever. Spengler thought that studying history allows us to discern recurrent patterns that would help us understand the future. I believe that we should study history because it allows us to discern recurrent patterns that help us understand human behavior, which is, in the end, the single most important thing for us to understand. Alternative rationales, such as exploring history for the sake of edification and entertainment, or to construct narratives of ethnic, religious, or national identity, may be perfectly respectable, but remain, to me at least, subordinate to the larger and essential goal of understanding our own species. Over the years, I've become increasingly concerned with a basic question. How are we to organize this study of patterns of human behavior in the past? In other words, to quote one of our organizers, was tun? Let me advance 3 simple propositions, all of which happen to take us in a Spenglerian direction. The first of them is that our engagement with history needs to be genuinely global in scope. There is only one history. Over the last 70,000 years or so, migrations out of Africa and onward made it global. Anyone who has spent any time teaching the most basic survey of world history can't help being struck by the numerous similarities in terms of challenges and responses, of dynamics and outcomes, of institutional and ideational development. The more one becomes aware of these recurrent regularities, the stranger the idea of studying the history just of any one place or period must seem. This is why Spengler reminded us of the need to apprehend history in its global totality. He thought it impossible fully to illuminate any fragment of history without clarifying the secret of world history overall. I agree. Whether or not we accept the existence of that common secret, the notion that we cannot hope to arrive at a proper understanding of the singular without understanding the whole strikes me as incontrovertibly true and essential. More specifically, world history is the only way to overcome what Spengler labeled a Ptolemaic system of history, where one way or another, everything is seen as revolving around Western Europe and creates optical illusions that inflate recent European history at the expense of eons of Asian, African, and American history. Even at the most strident, contemporary critics of anything that smacks of Eurocentrism could hardly do better than Spengler when he urged that das Wort Europa sollte aus der Geschichte gestrichen werden. The word Europe should be excised from history, as opposed to what he considered to be more meaningful terms, such as Occidental or Oriental, or the corresponding Spenglerian categories. World history is indeed a suitably Copernican system of envisioning our past. This does not mean that it is free from drawbacks, the most significant of which might seem the difficulty to reconcile a global approach to history with entrenched expectations of professional expertise. For how could any one scholar ever hope to know enough to roam across so many different societies, master all the languages, the bibliographies, the minutiae? But this seemingly insurmountable problem strikes me as more apparent than real and can easily be addressed. First, lift more historians out of their solitary confinement and gather them up in collaborative teams, as in the sciences or closer to home in archaeology. Let them pool their expertise. You already know this works. Second, stop pretending that this is a question of either or. Specialization has yielded immense advances to our understanding of every aspect of life, our world, and the universe. These gains must not and cannot be abandoned. But that doesn't make conventional modes of specialization the only game in town, nor does it require ever tighter compartmentalization of knowledge and research. The more specialization there is, the greater is the need for counterbalancing approaches that draw on these outputs to forge new connections and understandings. At the end of the day, there will always be an army of splitters to perform the indispensable groundwork, just as there will always be a shortage of inspired bundlers. And third, stop fetishizing expertise. We must allow ourselves to be humbled in our exposure to the unfamiliar, in our brazen overreach. Humbling experiences can only be good for us, as is losing our illusions about mastery. It is worth noting that the contemporary virtues of inclusion and decolonization critically rely on both. The ineluctable need to turn global has been driven home to me by the misery that is my own field, that what is conventionally called ancient history. Not, mind you, the ancient or early history of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean and its hinterlands, but just ancient history, as if other parts of the world had lacked such a thing. I endured a whole decade of this as a student in Austria. But once I moved on to the UK and then the US, I encountered, and if anything, even more baffling monstrosity, that of the so-called classics, once again labeled the classics, as if cultures outside the Greco-Roman sphere had never developed foundational traditions of their own. Spengler, in the introduction to Untergang, disposed of this venerable folly with a few choice words. Es ist ein ehrwürdiges Vorurteil, das wir endlich überwinden sollten, dass die Antike uns innerlich nahe steht, weil wir vermeintlich ihre Schüler und Nachkommen, weil wir tatsächlich ihre Anbeter gewesen sind. It is a venerable prejudice which we should finally overcome, that classical antiquity is intrinsically close to us, because we were supposedly its pupils and descendants, because we were in fact its worshippers. Wiser words have rarely been spoken. I can only count myself lucky that I found gainful employment in what may well be the only or one of the few classics programs where our choice of approach and subject matter is unfettered. Much of the field labors and languishes under much more onerous restrictions of canonicity, peer pressure, and masochistic self-policing. In any case, even a globalized ancient history would not be ancient in the sense of what Spengler rightly ridiculed as the unglaubwürdig dürftige und sinnlose Schema, the incredibly meager and pointless template of ancient, medieval, modern. Inasmuch as there was any ancient history at all, each culture had its own antiquity at different points in time. The antiquity of the Americas may have lagged in time behind that of the Middle East, but it was no less ancient. And why employ the ostensibly honorific but latently derogatory label ancient? In American parlance, to call something ancient history is to dismiss it as obsolete and irrelevant. As far as I'm concerned, the proper term is foundational. One doesn't have to go full Spengler to appreciate it in that respect. At least patterns of morphological association did indeed tend to be symmetrically structured as he would have it. Every culture worth the name experienced a foundational period. They deserve to be studied side by side. This brings me to my second demand, that history ought to be resolutely comparative. A global perspective does not by itself induce a comparative mindset. Witness the occasional mindlessness of Silk Road studies and the like. It is perfectly possible to study wide-ranging connectivities without even trying to understand the world. But that doesn't mean that we should. In fact, any world history that is not expressly comparative strikes me as a waste of time. Comparison is crucial. Without it, how would we even know why it is worth studying what we choose to study? And don't tell me that we should study things because we love them. We should love the challenge of understanding, not the subject matter as such. Reduced to essentials, comparative history is meant to give us a better handle on the question of why things turned out the way they did. It is a means of exploring causation. Spengler wasn't very keen on that, preferring as it did fate to cause, but neither are most academic historians, who have increasingly moved away from questions of cause and effect in favor of the exploration of complexity, experience, and meaning, and in rejection of anything that smacks of that most dreaded of all intellectual sins, reductionism. I myself like thinking about causation and about the calibration of reduction. These days, this makes me feel more at home with social scientists, for whom these concerns remain absolutely central. But whatever the current fashion, I remain convinced that historians stand much to gain from following their example. If denuded of a comparative approach, world history risks drowning in a soup of interconnectivity and basic sameness. Comparison brings out similarities, but is even more valuable in identifying differences and in seeking to account for such differences. Comparison alone reveals the rare or even unique and its relevance over the long run. The whole notion of Western civilization is predicated on a comparison often implicit rather than explicit to be sure, but informed nonetheless by a potent intimation of difference which eventually allowed a certain part of the world to bring about transformative change in institutions, science, technology, values, and all sorts of things that made that part of the world rich and powerful, while others were not. Whatever factors we choose to privilege in accounting for this process, from geography to ecology to institutions, religion, science, or racist colonial exploitation, we cannot hope to appreciate them without a comparative framework. Without it, history is bound to appear not just idiosyncratic, but random and opaque. But how are we to undertake these comparisons on a global scale? This brings me to my third and final point. Inasmuch as historians are even interested in broader patterns and causes, rival visions continue to coexist side by side. Back in the 1980s, Alexander Demand, the honorary president of the society, counted more than 200 reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire that had been put forward over time. Those reasons are all over the place, and some of them are actually mutually exclusive. And I doubt that we have made a lot of progress since then. A Russian ecologist and mathematician at the University of Connecticut, Peter Turchin, has used this as an example of the mess the study of history is in. From his vantage point in the sciences, he's urging us to turn history into an analytical, predictive field. This sounds bolder than it is, because at the heart of this initiative, called cliodynamics, is nothing more, but also nothing less, than a call for more disciplined scholarship. Verbal theory should be translated into mathematical models to derive precise predictions, which can then be tested on empirical material. This, needless to say, has long been standard practice in the social and natural sciences. The overall goal is to discover general principles that explain the functioning and dynamics of actual historical societies, culminating in solidly tested unifying theories. In practice, this initiative has focused on recurrent developments. The rise and fall of states occupies an especially prominent position in the work that has been done so far, in no small part because there are so many historical cases to draw on. Unsurprisingly, this approach works best with large data sets and therefore on a global and long-term scale. This has given rise to what Turchin calls secular cycle theory, the notion that agrarian societies experience periods of instability every 200 or 300 years, which can be linked to predictable interaction of demographic, economic, and psychological dynamics. More recently, Turchin has applied this approach to the study of the United States up to the present and into the future. I don't want to get bogged down in details or privilege one analytical approach over others, for there are many. I'm currently involved in the collaborative social science project run out of Princeton that seeks to understand the dynamics of societal collapse across space and time. The Santa Fe Institute has long been supported science-inflected research in this vein. And this is not all. A particularly tantalizing way of bringing light into the apparent chaos and opacity of history is to recreate it, to rerun it. This may sound like a fantasy, but is not in fact as odd as it might seem. When I was a child, weather forecasts were often wrong, maybe even most of the time, or at least so it seemed. Today, they no longer are. Ever more sophisticated computational modeling has lent a helping hand. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to say one day that historical interpretation used to be scarcely better than guesswork, whereas it is now much closer to the mark? Spengler thought he could do the job, but he was on his own and limited to book and pen. Since then, we have come up with more sophisticated means of exploration. To give just one example, back in 2013, a team of scientists published a paper that simulated large-scale state formation in the Old World over the course of 3,000 years, from 1500 BC to 1500 AD. The objective was to predict how frequently a particular region would end up as part of a larger state. The parameters were aggressively simple: basic features of the physical terrain, access to domesticated horses, rainfall, and the like. Few, if any, conventional historians would expect such a threadbare construct to generate anything but noise. In truth, the simulation approximated actual development so closely that it accounted for 2/3 of observed variance in historical outcomes in state formation. In other words, if you compare trend maps for actual history and simulated history, they look quite similar. More recently, a former team member, Jim Bennett, has developed an only slightly more fine-grained model, which now accounts for 3/4 of observed variance in state formation. We are working together, and it is already easy to say how a few more refinements could produce an even closer match between retroactive prediction, or retrodiction, to use the fancy technical term, and what actually happened in the past. It is true that this exercise measures only a single variable. In that sense, it is embarrassingly simple. But one would hope that this is just the beginning. Nobody has ever tried to build simulations of historical development that are even a fraction as complex and sophisticated as those built to explain climate change. If we did try, the results might well be nothing short of astounding. The big challenge is to develop model simulations that recreate patterns of change over time. Spengler observed that we lacked an art of historical study. Retrodictive simulation, evolutionary modeling, are promising tools for fashioning precisely such an art. I, for one, am not at all surprised that these efforts are undertaken by curious and clever people outside the historical profession, and that they are usually ignored by those within that profession. Oswald-Spengler, I suspect, would not have found that very surprising either. But that cannot be a reason for giving up. On the contrary, it should give us hope. In the end, salvation may come from unexpected quarters, not from a traditional humanistic pursuit of history, but from the heart of what has remade the world, the application of scientific principles and techniques. For all we know, even the tangled pathways of history will one day be laid wide open to the pitiless glare of modernity. And when that finally happens, it won't be a moment too soon. Thank you very much.
So, dear Walter Scheidel, thank you very much for this really inspirational speech. I think we all learned a lot. So this is unquestionably one of the scholarly highlights of our history of our society until now. And we regret so much not to be able to continue now our interaction in a more informal or less formal way, and to just continue all that around a glass of wine and discuss all these issues in a more personal way. Unfortunately, due to reasons outside of our influence, we are reduced just to reiterate our thanks in a virtual hybrid form. Thanking you very much again, expressing our gratitude also for your acceptance of the second Oswald-Spengler Prize from the year 2020.